In 2017, one of the largest data breaches in history exposed the personal information of nearly 150 million people. To achieve this, hackers exploited a software vulnerability residing on the servers of Equifax. They took advantage of an obscure vulnerability in an industry-standard system called Apache Struts. So what happened? Well, it's anything but straightforward, and not much has been said about what happened in the code. Here at the Vulnerability History Project, we like to dive into those messy technical details. Let's learn about how these attacks unfolded. We'll unpack the vulnerable code and talk about some of the lessons that all software engineers can learn from. Ready? Our story begins in August of 2012. The vulnerable code was mistakenly introduced into the Struts codebase that allowed attacks to remotely execute code on web servers by manipulating specific HTTP request headers, and remained unnoticed for almost 5 years. Apache Struts is a free and open source framework used to build web applications primarily in the Java programming language. On March 7th of 2017, Apache Struts developers released a patch to fix the newly found vulnerability. Now, just 2 days later, the IT staff over at Equifax were told to apply the patch. But like many organizations, they failed to do so. And those missteps would cost them dearly. A few days later, Equifax scanned their system to see if any of their systems were vulnerable. But the scans they used came back negative by mistake. Chinese hackers first breached Equifax's systems on March 10th, one day after Equifax employees were instructed to patch their systems. To start their attack, the hackers did their own scan of Equifax's systems to detect if anything was vulnerable. Unlike Equifax's IT department, the hackers' scans were both earlier and more effective. A vulnerable system was identified, one of Equifax's consumer complaint web portals, and it was the perfect target. The hackers began probing the system by making what seemed like typical requests to the consumer complaint portal, same as you or I would from our browsers. But they swapped out the message of the content type header in their HTTP requests with malicious bits of code that could be run on a server. Now, ordinarily, a content type header is a benign piece of metadata that might look like this. But the attackers were sending exploits that looked more like this. The attackers were able to execute their own code on Equifax servers, the same servers with all that personal data. More on that in a moment. With Struts being an open source project, we've got public records of the exact fix for this vulnerability. Let's take a look. Here we have a commit to a Git repository. This is essentially a record-keeping tool used by software engineers to track their code. Think of it like track changes in Word, but a whole lot more sophisticated. This is the difference comparison, or diff, of the vulnerable code on the left in red and the fixed code in green on the right. That's about it. 5 lines of vulnerable code that went wrong. There was also another commit related to this, so we're talking about maybe 20 lines of Java code in total on a project which at the time had over 150,000 lines of code. To put that in perspective, that's like finding a single wrong pixel in this image. So what is this content type header thing? Well, it's a piece of metadata attached to an HTTP request that tells the server what we're sending it. It's like going to the post office and filling out a customs form. You say, "My package has perishable food in it." Now, the post office could eventually inspect the package to make sure you're telling the truth, and they likely will, but telling them up front helps them process the package better. Same thing with content type. It's meant to help the server determine what it's looking at so it can use the right tools to process the data. Equifax used standard Struts deserialization tooling for this content type. Deserialization roughly is how we take a stream of data and get the information we need out of it. If the format is wrong, Struts returns a helpful error message, as any good software would. Now, a good error message is going to be detailed, right? You want as much context as you can to debug a problem. But in this case, Struts wants to include the original data that the untrusted user has provided in its error message. This will be an important detail later on. In its error handling logic, Struts called this function. The word localized here has to do with internationalization. People complain in multiple human languages, right? So an error message should be translated into various languages, like Spanish or German. This is where everything begins to go south because, as harmless as this function appears to be, buried within it contains support for interpreting and executing OGNL code. Wait, what? What is OGNL code now? Good question. OGNL is a general-purpose deserialization library for Java objects. So, to recap, the content type metadata is intended to be data, but when it errors out, that error message, including the bad data that caused the error message, is run through another utility that executes it as code. So this data is no longer data, it's code. If you're surprised by that, so were we. This content type field is treated in a far more complex manner than it appears. And when the developer originally called the localization lookup, they likely didn't realize it either. As specific as this sounds, this is actually a common mistake. It's called injection, which is when data becomes code. It comes from unsafe string concatenation, where strings that were intended to be data get combined with other strings and the whole string is executed. This is a particularly bad instance of arbitrary code execution. Sounds scary? It is. The result is what we call a confused deputy situation. Let's go back to the post office to ship a package. You've been asked to check a box on a form if you have any perishable items in your package, but instead you write, "Hey, there's a big package in the back marked Equifax. Please give it to me." The clerk, or in Equifax's case, the web servers running Struts, say, this doesn't look right. So let me hand this message to my colleague who might understand this customer's language. The colleague, or in our case, the OGNL library, gets tricked by your response and hands you the big package in the back marked Equifax. For better or for worse, computers do exactly what you tell them to do. So how is this mess fixed? Well, as with most vulnerabilities, once you know where to look, it's easy. The fixed code returns a generic error message and skips reflecting the untrusted data in the error message. So back to our Chinese hackers who exploited this vulnerability at Equifax. As time passed, the hackers pulled data out of the network for months undetected. They did this by using administrator accounts that they found, encrypting the data, and downloading them as small compressed files, and deleting information that tracked their activity. Equifax could have inspected all the encrypted data that the hackers were stealing, but they needed a valid encryption certificate. They had not renewed their expired encryption certificate for almost 10 months. In renewing their certificate, the data breach was discovered in July 2017. Equifax announced the data breach on September 8, 2017. Now, an obvious lesson here is that we should keep our systems up to date. Struts found and fixed this vulnerability, but Equifax didn't respond effectively or quick enough. But that's an operational issue. How can software engineers learn from this? Here are a few lessons. First, while it's always a good idea to provide specific details in error messages, it's a risk to reflect user data that was erroneous. After all, it's malformed to begin with, so it won't conform to what you expect. So don't shoot yourself in the foot by injecting malformed user data into an error message about the data being malformed. Second, know your utilities. Making your code reusable is good practice, full stop. But when you're using someone else's code, make sure you know what it does. And if you're the person making the utility code, make it clear that you're, executing expressions too. Making a util is a common practice for developers, and it's a good way to help out your colleagues. Interestingly, we at the Vulnerability History Project see an inordinate amount of vulnerabilities related to utility files. Stay tuned for that research, though. Third, And this is a big one. Always be wary of string concatenations. Injection vulnerabilities are when data becomes code. And if you're concatenating strings together, the combined result might be very different than what you expect. You can't always avoid string concatenations. Just start questioning whether injection is possible when you do. And finally, localization is complex. Here at the Vulnerability History Project, we're seeing a large chunk of vulnerabilities involve some sort of localization. You can't avoid localization altogether, but let's remember that it often adds responsibilities to your code that make it harder to understand. Like here, the vulnerable code was doing both error handling and localization all in one place. The Equifax breach was one for the history books, but fortunately, this history is out there in the open for us to learn from it. This case study has been brought to you by the Vulnerability History Project, a nonprofit open-source effort that curates all of the engineering failures that go into vulnerabilities in modern software. We're a museum of mistakes that help you engineer better software. Come check us out at vulnerabilityhistory.org.